Born Mary Ann Todd in Lexington, Kentucky, December 13th, 1818, Mary was the fourth of 7 children and was raised in comfort and refinement. And yes, the Todd family had slaves. Mary Todd Lincoln is not one of America's favorite first ladies, nor has she ever been. In a world where women were to look pretty, raise children, and not have much to say, Mary looked pretty, bore 4 children, and had plenty to say. Her unpopularity was due to the fact that Mary was very intelligent, quite observant, and well educated, and could out-talk, out-argue, out-debate any man who disagreed with her political opinions. And therein lay the problem. It was the mid-1800s, and women were not supposed to have opinions. One thing was very certain. She adored her husband, agreed with his politics, and did everything she could to support him, encourage him, and provide him with the critical thinking skills he would need to become the 16th President of the United States. Mary would later become known as Mrs. Abraham Lincoln. Want to know more about Mary? Let's have a look at her early childhood. This is the home of Mary's parents, Robert Smith Todd, a successful banker, and his wife, Elizabeth Parker Todd. Mary's father very much enjoyed discussing politics. Among Mary Todd's fondest memories were those occasions when company came to dinner and lively rounds of political conversation ensued. Unfortunately, when Mary was 6 years old, her mother died giving birth to her 7th child. This upset Mary so much, as they were very close. Sometime later, the length of time has been disputed. Her father married Elizabeth Betsy Humphreys. They had 9 children together. It was rumored that Betsy, the stepmother, was not as easygoing as was Elizabeth. It was said that Betsy spent most of her time upstairs in her room nursing one pregnancy after the other, and she really didn't have much time to give to Robert's first 7 children. But let's also look at this from Betsy's point of view. Robert Todd married her when she was 26 years old. In those days, a 26-year-old woman was pretty darn close to spinsterhood, and of course one wonders if he didn't lure her into marriage. He'd have to. I doubt his proposal sounded anything like, "My dear Betsy, please do me the honor of being my wife. It would mean so much to me, and by the way, I just know my 7 kids are going to adore you. And we'll make more children. How does 9 sound? Oh, and my mother lives next door. Now, she's not fond of the fact that I'm looking to remarry so quickly, so watch out. But the point is, she's very close by, and the children adore her, so you'll have plenty of help." There have been people who have speculated that this was a marriage of practicality and not one of romance. As a child, Mary did not get along with her stepmother, but it is said that as she matured into adulthood, she appreciated what her stepmother had gone through. When Mary was in grade school, she attended Dr. John Ward's Academy for 6 years until she was 14, then transferred to Madame Mentel's French School for Girls. Conversation at Madame's was in French. However, none of the conversation concerned politics, as young ladies in those days were not expected to occupy their minds with such complex topics. Mary remained at Madame's for 4 years. Then she returned to Dr. Ward's Academy for 2 additional years of study. In the United States, up until the last quarter of the 20th century, the social construct primarily involved marriage, child rearing, as many kids as possible, and securing a respectable and socially approved position within one's local society. So, if you were a young lady who wished to study, say, archaeology, and your dream was to be a part of excavation teams around the Great Pyramid, well, it just wasn't done. Well, it was done, but the family was left home to endure nosy questions as to why you weren't married, why you weren't yet interested in having babies, and what was the fascination with digging in the dirt anyway. A proper young lady was expected to be schooled in all forms of home economics and the social graces. She was also expected to marry someone like this guy, or maybe this guy. Certainly not this, or his cabin. At least he's not this. You know, this guy may not be so bad after all. As a matter of fact, Todd did marry this fellow, but not until many years later. Abraham Lincoln was born to Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on the Sinking Spring Farm, Hardin County, Kentucky. There were very few schoolhouses on the frontier in those days, so Abe Lincoln's formal education amounted to the equivalent of the completion of first grade. That said, he taught himself to improve his reading and writing skills. He read constantly, so much so he was able to pass entrance exams into law school. He truly was a self-made man. One evening, when Mary's sister Elizabeth and her husband were hosting a dinner party, Mary and Elizabeth were introduced to a gentleman brought to the party by a mutual friend. The gentleman was Abraham Lincoln. He took one look at Mary and said, "Miss Todd, I have been wanting to dance with you in the worst way." Thus began a long and sometimes tumultuous courtship. Abe Lincoln and Mary Todd were married November 4th, 1842, in the home of Mary's sister, Elizabeth, and her husband. Their first child, Robert Todd Lincoln, was born 9 months later. What you see here is Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois. They purchased the home in 1844. During the time they lived here, Lincoln was elected to the House of Representatives in 1846. Mary gave birth to their second child, Edward Baker Lincoln, in the same year. Unfortunately, little Eddie died at age 3 of tuberculosis in 1850. The Lincolns were devastated. Also in 1850, Mary gave birth to their third child, William Wallace Lincoln. Abe and Mary's fourth child, Thomas Lincoln, who they called Tad, was born in 1853. Abe was elected president in 1860. Willie died of typhoid fever 2 years later in the White House at age 12. Clearly, those 2 decades were filled with great joy and tremendous grief. Each time with the deaths of Eddie and Willie, Mary would go into a deep depression. She suffered with migraine headaches and was, at times, short-tempered with those around her. Despite what Lincoln's law partners said about Mary being a hellcat, others claimed that the Lincolns enjoyed many happy years together and made for a formidable political team. They were like-minded and shared many of the same interests. Abraham Lincoln described their marriage as a matter of profound wonder. By the time the Lincolns had moved into the White House in 1861, the great house had fallen into severe disrepair. The draperies had dry-rotted, carpets were worn and threadbare, wallpaper was peeling, and much of the furniture was worn and scarred. Even the White House china was chipped, and some of the crystal stemware was mismatched. There were leaks in the ceiling. Mrs. Lincoln decided that repairs and replacements had to be made. Despite a $20,000 appropriation for furnishings, the budget was exceeded. 2 supplemental appropriations were needed to pay for the additional purchases. Now today we might joke about Mary Lincoln engaging in a bit of retail therapy, but there are those in the medical community who regard retail therapy as a form of self-medication, especially when it comes to depression. Mary was born into a family of wealth and privilege. Spending this kind of money was nothing new to her. However, now the bills were being paid by the tax-paying citizens and not her father. Even though similar amounts had been spent in the past by previous First Ladies, Mrs. Lincoln received much criticism. The press described her White House purchases as tasteless extravagance. However, it was loved by the public. The china was dubbed the Royal Purple Set and was greatly admired. It was so well suited for official White House use that subsequent presidents ordered additional pieces to augment the original Lincoln purchase. During the mid-1800s, spiritualism became a strong religious movement in America. People would gather in each other's homes for the purpose of communicating with their loved ones who had died either from sickness or by way of injuries suffered during the Civil War. They had no churches, there were no preachers. In each group, there would be the spiritualist or medium who would communicate with someone's spirit by way of a series of knocks on the table or floor. Why did this become so popular? Well, during the 16th and 17th century, religion was dominated by very puritanical attitudes. If someone even spoke of wishing to communicate with a dead loved one, they could have been accused of witchcraft, gone to trial, and put to death. The early 1800s experienced a boom in industrialism. Scientific discoveries eased up the old attitudes and allowed people to explore and experiment with different religions and philosophies. The White House saw its share of seances, especially during the Civil War. Mrs. Lincoln, having lost 2 children early on, sought comfort among other grieving parents and hosted a number of seances. Even though the practice was widely accepted, there were still those who refused to let the truth get in the way of a good story. Spiritualism offered to those who had lost loved ones an experience that was more comforting than traditional Christian beliefs. The mid-1800s also had the added benefit of photography. Spiritualists who took advantage of grieving parents and widows soon learned the art of double exposure and could create images that showed a ghostly loved one with his arms around the grieving widow, a type of photoshopping, you might say. The Civil War provided plenty of paying customers. Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley was born into slavery February 1818 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia. Her parents were Agnes Hobbs and George Pleasant, who was actually her stepfather. As a young woman, Elizabeth became a dressmaker, and it wasn't too long before all the ladies in town recognized that she was not just a dressmaker, but had a keen eye on fashion and knew how to make fabric and color work together beautifully. She developed a very loyal clientele and eventually was able to buy her freedom from her owners. She moved to Washington, D.C., where she set up shop and soon became known as the city's premier fashion designer. Her clients claimed there was no dress the hands of Elizabeth Keckley could not make. Soon she became the personal modiste and confidant to Mary Todd Lincoln, and for 4 years spent much time in the White House. In those days, as mentioned earlier, women were not expected to express their political opinions in public. However, Elizabeth Keckley noted in her autobiography that Mary was quick to donate to the Contraband Relief Association, a charitable organization which Keckley herself founded. The organization provided assistance to people fleeing slavery during the Civil War. A letter to the editor of the Chicago Tribune, written by journalist and abolitionist Jane Grey Swisshelm, described Mary as more radically opposed to slavery than even her husband, Abraham Lincoln. Mary Lincoln's own writings indicate that while she was raised in a home cared for by slaves, she grew up to abhor the idea of slavery. She wrote sympathetically about the plight of black refugees in Washington and wrote letters on behalf of former slaves seeking government employment, including Elizabeth Keckley. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant near Appomattox Courthouse. 4 days later, on April 14th, President Lincoln and his wife Mary attended the play Our American Cousin, a popular comedy at Ford's Theater. They sat in their usual box, which they shared with another couple who attended the play with them. Mary sat next to her husband, and they held hands. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, was an actor and was familiar with the layout of the theater. He was able to sneak upstairs where he shot President Lincoln. Mary was still holding his hand. It took her a moment to realize what had happened. Booth had jumped over the balcony onto the stage where he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis! The South is avenged." He also had broken his leg. Evidently on his way down, the spur of one of his boots had caught one of the flags and positioned his leg for a closed fracture of the left fibula on impact with the stage. He was still able to make his getaway on horseback. President Lincoln was immediately taken across the street to the Peterson House, placed in bed, and doctors were called. Mary Lincoln was able to spend only a few minutes with her dying husband. Her weeping and repeated pleas to God to let Abraham live made some of the men, members of Lincoln's administration, feel uncomfortable. They felt her behavior was unbecoming that of the position of First Lady. Mrs. Lincoln was so visibly distraught that Secretary of War Stanton ordered the First Lady out of the President's room. She spent the night in the front parlor and was not present when her husband died. After President Lincoln's death, the First Lady's public grieving was seen as evidence that she was an improper woman. The search for Booth lasted about 10 days. He was discovered in a barn on Garrett's Farm near Port Royal, Virginia, on April 25th. After some negotiation, which Booth rejected, he was shot through the neck by Army Sergeant Boston Corbett. He died a short time later. Abraham Lincoln died without a will. It was the 1800s, and women were most often financially dependent on their husbands and had no income of their own. Property was automatically left to the firstborn son if no other provisions had been made. The son would then make sure his mother and unmarried sisters were provided for. In fact, a woman's social status could be severely affected by the financial shape in which she was left by her deceased husband. Women were expected to maintain a certain propriety in their lives if their husbands died first. It was proper to continue living in the same home. It was proper to maintain the same lifestyle. And it was proper to continue fulfilling one's social and charitable obligations. These societal conventions were very strongly held. If a woman could not maintain them, she would be thought less of, and in many cases shunned by her friends and neighbors. These proprieties were supposedly rooted in morality, and therein lay the hypocrisy. Unfortunately, this was the case for Mary Todd Lincoln. She was deeply in debt and ended up selling many of her personal belongings. Mary eventually paid off her debts. However, vicious rumors ruined her reputation and relationship with many friends. Abraham's estate was finally settled and she received $36,000 in cash and securities. Mary adored her fourth son, Tad. They were very close. Unfortunately, she did not share the same closeness with her first son, Robert. By this time, Robert had graduated from Harvard Law School and had set up a very successful law practice. In 1871, at the age of 18, Tad Lincoln died from a lung disease. Mary was inconsolable. Afterwards, she traveled in the United States and Canada and occasionally visited spiritualists in hopes of making contact with her deceased loved ones. This grief seemed to follow Mary for much of her life. First, her mother died when she was only 6 years old. Later, Mary lost 3 of her 4 children to illness. Her husband had been assassinated as he sat by her side holding her hand. She soon feared she might also lose her firstborn, Robert. This fear became so pronounced that it soon overwhelmed her while visiting friends in Florida. She rushed to Chicago, where Robert lived, to make sure he was okay. Now, let's take a look at Mary's age during this time. She was 57. Tad had just died 4 years earlier when Mary was 53. She was 47 when Abe was assassinated. According to the National Institute on Aging, menopausal transition most often begins between ages 45 and 55. It usually lasts about 7 years, but can last as long as 14 years. Women who suffered with particularly bad menopausal symptoms were often sent to insane asylums by their doctors because the doctors simply didn't know what else to do. And most doctors were not likely to be concerned because this was a malady from which they themselves never suffered. Mary's only surviving son, Robert, became concerned with his mother's behavior and decided she needed to be placed in an asylum where she could rest and recover. Illinois law required a jury trial to determine insanity, so Robert took his mother to court in May 1875. The trial lasted 3 hours. Witnesses for the prosecution testified that Mary shopped excessively, complained about strange pains, and obsessed about imagined dangers. A jury of 12 men ruled her insane and appointed Robert as conservator of her estate. Mary, who did not know about the trial until that day, sat quietly through the proceedings. The next day, Robert took Mary to Bellevue Place Sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois. During her 3-month stay at Bellevue, Mary cooperated with the staff but wrote letters to friends to help with her release. In September 1875, she was discharged into the care of her sister Elizabeth in Springfield, Illinois. The following June, Elizabeth's husband defended Mary in a second hearing with a jury that declared her restored to reason. In September 1876, Mary sailed for Europe and lived in France for several years. After hurting her back in a fall, she returned to the United States in 1880. Plagued by pain and poor vision, and possibly diabetes and arthritis, Mary stayed in 2 rooms in her sister Elizabeth's home in Springfield. On July 15, 1882, the anniversary of Todd's death, Mary collapsed and slipped into a coma. She died the next day. In 2016, a California cardiologist by the name of John G. Sotos advanced what he said was a fresh theory to explain some of Mary's behavior. She suffered from a deficiency of vitamin B12, probably caused by an ailment called pernicious anemia. Dr. Sotos detailed his theory in the journal Perspectives in Biology and Medicine, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press. He says, the ailment begins with an autoimmune attack on the stomach, which then stops making the chemical that helps absorb vitamin B12. The symptoms of deficiency appear months to years after the body's storehouse of B12 is depleted, and over time, symptoms arise from more and more of the body's organs. Dr. Soto stated it's likely she was predisposed to it genetically. Mary's physical afflictions included fevers, headaches, fatigue, a rapid heartbeat, progressive weakness, a sallow complexion, tingling of the skin, irritability, delusions, and hallucinations, all of which are consistent with vitamin B12 deficiency. While Mary was quite unpopular with many people, Dr. Sotos contends that she was simply a woman with a biochemically injured brain struggling in a complicated, relentlessly demanding environment. Her health issues aside, Mary Todd Lincoln was one of the most influential first ladies in the White House. She helped women gain employment in the government. She demanded they receive equal pay for the same job. She supported all women in their endeavors outside the home. She backed a female nursing corps. She was the first to welcome African Americans as guests in the White House. Her unabashed interest and aggressive advocacy of the abolition of slavery complemented her husband's political stance in the White House. Mary never missed an opportunity to introduce the topic of slavery at dinner, at ladies' luncheons, women's meetings, and always from the perspective of the slave. One biographer has suggested that Mary would have been pleased with her funeral. Businesses in downtown Springfield were closed that day, and hundreds of people lined up to attend the service. The church was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements. 3 ministers conducted the service, and afterwards the mourners traveled to Oak Ridge Cemetery, where Mary Todd Lincoln was laid to rest with her beloved Abraham.